But I'm really excited to work with you guys. So let me give you a breakdown of what we'll be talking about. I'm going to go over some basic strategy for the SAT regarding timing, time management, question prioritization, stuff like that. Then we'll do some reading practice, some writing and language practice. Then we'll move on to math practice. So let me just put a link here in the chat. That link is to a practice test we'll be working from in a little bit, but I just wanted you guys to have that so you can pull it up when we're ready to discuss. Without further ado, let's start by getting into my discussion of strategy. If you watched the video that was sent with some of the other introductory materials, some of this might be a little familiar for you, but it's worth kind of going over again, and I'll present it maybe in a little bit different light. Here we go. Let's start off just kind of with a breakdown of what the SAT is, or pardon me, a breakdown of kind of the basics of the SAT. First thing off is the way it's structured. Reading comes first, then writing, and math, then when it comes to a conclusion with the essay. So the breakdown of that is you start off with the English reading portion, which is 65 minutes. You get a 10-minute break, then you go into the writing section. You go straight into the math without a calculator section. There's no break in between those two sections. You get a 5-minute break, then you go into the math without a calculator, you get a 2-minute break, and then the essay. If you're not taking the essay, you're free to leave. Okay, getting into kind of our general description of the category. So our reading section, that's your first section. You're going to have 4 individual passages and 1 set of paired passages. The paired passages will be 2 smaller passages that will be paired together because they talk about a similar topic or are in a discussion with each other. So your questions will be about them individually and about making comparisons between them. Moving on to our writing and language section, this is going to have 4 passages. All of it's going to be nonfiction. You'll have 1 fiction passage on the reading section, but all of your writing and language will be nonfiction, with 11 questions for each passage. That comes out, this is the least amount of time you have per question on the assessment, but these go fairly quickly because the reading and the questions are concurrent rather than being separated into blocks of reading and blocks of questions, but we'll get to kind of the time element in a second. So this is important to discuss in terms of what to look for on the writing and language section. As you're taking your test, as you're working going forward, you want to be paying attention to the kinds of things you're having trouble with or the kinds of things you're doing well with. On the writing and language section, the questions are usually divided into more rhetoric-based questions and more rules-based questions. So the rhetoric-based questions are about the structure of ideas, how arguments are built, are details supporting a certain statement, while rules-based questions are, as the name implies, based on rules. Do you use a period or a comma? Should the comma go inside or outside of the quotation marks? So knowing these rules is a really simple solution if you're having trouble on those kinds of questions. These are some lists of the different English conventions, which refers to the rules that might be tested. We have sentence structure, conventions of usage, and conventions of punctuation. Sentence structure talks about things like sentence boundaries, subordination and coordination, parallel structures, modifier placement, shifts in verb tense, mood, voice, etc., shifts in pronoun, person, and number. Conventions of usage, so that's about using appropriate words, descriptions, etc. So things like pronoun clarity, possessive determiners, agreement, frequently confused words, logical comparisons, and conventional expressions. And then we have conventions of punctuation, like those examples I gave before about end of sentence punctuation, within sentence punctuation, whether apostrophes are possessive or not, items in a series, non-restrictive or parenthetical elements, or unnecessary punctuation. So all of these are very technical names, but one thing that's important is that as you continue practicing, you start to take notice of, in the writing and language section, are the questions you're having trouble with involving semicolons? Are they about colons? Do you have trouble with the punctuation questions or the sentence structure questions. Once you identify that, you can go back to the basics, kind of the basic structure of these, this part of the test, and look at these rules and kind of reverse engineer what you need to do. You can learn the rules, and that way, when they come up the next time, you'll be prepared for them. That's the writing and language passage. Moving on to the math section. So it's separated into two separate sections, no calculator and calculator. In kind of the general conception of math, it seems like the calculator section should be easier. Well, there's not really a specific way we can categorize something as easy or not easy, but certainly for the calculator section, they compensate for the fact that you have a calculator by making questions a little bit more in-depth. Usually they involve more real-life circumstances and involve a little bit more interpretation and problem solving. The no calculator section involves a lot of basic algebra, logical problem solving, as opposed to more real-world applications. So the topics that are generally covered: Art of Algebra, Passport to Advanced Math, Problem Solving and Data Analysis, Additional Topics in Math, kind of similar to the writing and language sections, all kind of fancy names for the groups of topics they're putting in here. Art of Algebra, which is about a third of the kind of questions you're going to see, that's Algebra 1. Linear algebra, one version of x equals some version of y, or vice versa, where we're not going to see exponents, square roots, anything like that. A little bit more than a third of the questions you're going to see throughout the math sections. A little less than a third, Passport to Advanced Math, that's a step up, but it's still algebra. Now you're going to see exponents, you're going to see square roots, you're going to see the quadratic formula come up a lot. Then getting to problem solving and data analysis, this is where it shifts particularly into the more real-world application sphere of mathematics. So this comes up a lot in the calculator portion, where you'll need to be able to calculate things like mean, median, and mode. You'll need to be able to look at a set of data and interpret it. Things like standard deviation, while a little bit more complicated in terms of data analysis, statistics, stuff like that, you usually won't need to memorize the formula or anything, but you'll have to understand what those concepts are and how they're used. Okay, we'll be able to come back to some of these reference sheets once we go over math. Right now, let's talk about our strategy, the foundation of our strategy. So each of these different parts of the text, I talked about the time, the amount of time we have for each of them. Each part of the test has a limited amount of time, and that's going to affect how you should take the test. If you find in your practicing that you're consistently running out of time, then you need to make some adjustments. You want to be in a situation where you can comfortably complete all of your problems without going over the time limit. However, there are some ways that we can kind of work with that limited amount of time. And that gets us to guessing. Guessing is an option on the SAT. It's a multiple choice test where, save for a few parts of the math section, you're able to choose one of the answers provided. There's 4 options on all the multiple choice answers, all multiple choice questions. In a worst case scenario, you're able to choose one of those answers and you have a 1 in 4 chance of guessing correctly. If we, say that you guess on 4 questions, with a pretty high amount of confidence, we can say you got 1 correct and count that as a point in our estimation of how you did. With that time limit, with that ability to guess, we can kind of start to put together the structure of our strategy. You want to prioritize certain types of questions. And those types of questions are the easy ones, the quick ones, and the ones you're familiar with. Easy ones, those usually come along earlier in the passage for the math section. For the reading section and for the writing and language section, that is going to depend on your skill set. Part of practicing, in addition to improving your skill set, is identifying your strengths so you can shape your strategy around that. So when you're going through, you want to be identifying the questions that you know you're going to be able to do easily, and you know you're probably going to get correct. We want to get those out of the way. The reason we do that is because we want to avoid a situation where you're stuck on a problem that you don't know how to do, is consuming a lot of your uh, valuable time, and is keeping you from putting points on the board, essentially, from getting those questions you know you're going to get correct done. So if you prioritize the questions that you're confident in, you can get those out of the way first and kind of have a bigger cushion of time to then work through the more difficult, more time-consuming questions. Part of practicing, as I mentioned earlier, is about identifying your skill set, identifying the different ways that the test is going to ask you questions, identifying the different content areas that are going to be coming your way so you can react to it by emphasizing your skill set. And that's part of the reason why we go through this discussion of what you'll see on each passage and kind of what makes up the questions that you're going to be seeing. We're coming up to my end of the discussion of strategy. Just kind of talked a little bit generally now. We'll get into more specifics as we move on to practice. Does anyone have any questions for me? You're free to put it in the chat, but I'm going to move on to our practice test. I'd like to begin our discussion with the reading test. So if you pull up that link, that should be on page 4 of the document, page 2 at the bottom. Our reading test here, we can see this is our first passage, right? Questions 1 through 10. We look at our blurb. This passage is adapted from Saki, the Schwartz-Metterklume method, originally published in 1911. This is going to be our literature portion of the reading section. So this is going to be the fiction portion. We continue through here, we see Save Our Cities and Ourselves from the Automobile. This is going to be an essay that you'll have to interpret. And here on page 6, we can see with figure 1 and figure 2, some of our data interpretation questions. So whenever something like this comes up, it might come up in different formats. So here we have pie charts. It might be a bar graph, might just be a data table. Anytime that comes up, you're going to have 2 or 3 questions that are going to ask you about that. So when that occurs, you want to isolate those questions and save them. You do all the reading questions first, then you want to approach the data questions. And the reason you want to separate them is because it's going to make that prioritization that we talked about earlier easier. Because that way you don't have to mix up, looking at the passage, then you have to look at another source. If you keep them separate, you can approach them one at a time, and it makes the process go a little bit cleaner. There we have one of our nonfiction, one of our essay passages. Moving ahead here. This passage here is one of the hard science passages, so you'll see about things like chemistry, biology, anything like that, as opposed to some of the soft sciences like history or sociology or something like that. Usually these have some more complicated vocabulary or terminology that they use, but it's always going to be internally consistent. If you're having trouble with a term they keep referring to or a concept, there is going to be somewhere in that passage where it is explained or some sort of context clue where you'll be able to figure out what that means so that you can use it in other parts of the passage. So that's something to look out for when you get to those hard science passages. Moving on to our next one. Here we get to our paired passage. So we can see we have Talleyrand's report on public instruction is paired with Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. One is published in 1791, the other in 1792. They give us some more context. This is pretty common for the paired passages where there are 2 passages by a significant historical figure. Usually they'll be in opposition to each other. Occasionally they'll just diverge slightly, but there's usually going to be some sort of conversation, connection, or opposition between the 2 that you'll be asked about. And that brings us to passage 2 of that with Wollstonecraft. And then our final passage, which is another hard science passage about colony collapse disorder. And we can see they've included another data analysis portion. Okay, let's start working through a few of these reading passages to see what our strategy should be. You watch the video, you know that the reading strategy that I advocate for involves reading the questions first. So the reason we want to read the questions first is because that way you know what you're going to be asked about. If you approach the passage first, if you start reading immediately, which seems like the common sense thing to do, you're reading without an idea of what you're looking for. It becomes a process of trying to absorb everything and then being asked questions, as opposed to knowing what you're going to be asked and searching specifically for what you know is going to come up later. So when we search more specifically and with a view of what we're going to be asked later, that's going to be more efficient. It's going to save us a lot of that very valuable time, and it's going to make us more accurate in answering our questions. So let's take a look at some of our questions and start to break down the ways that questions are asked, what kind of questions we're going to see, how we respond to them, and what kind of questions we prioritize. For each passage, you're going to have between 10 and 12 questions. So we can see here, 1 to 10. So let's start with number 1. Which choice best summarizes the passage? This is a pretty common one, as you can imagine. So when it's asking us about summarizing the passage, that means it's asking us about the passage as a whole. These are usually going to be fairly straightforward, but that conception of the passage as a whole is a little bit more difficult to develop when we do that specific search for answers. Okay, so these are ones we probably want to answer other questions and come back to. Because when we answer specific questions, by answering those, by looking through and finding the answers, we're developing a comprehensive understanding of the passage. We can kill 2 birds with 1 stone if we come back to those after approaching our other questions. Let's move on to number 2. In line 2, turn most nearly means. This is a great example of the specific question that I was just mentioning. These kinds of questions are asking us about vocabulary and context. They give us a word or a term. They ask us what that means in the way that they use it. These kinds of questions are ones to prioritize because they're going to go quickly, because they're going to be fairly straightforward to answer. Question number 2 is going to be a question we prioritize once we go through. Moving on to number 3. The passage most clearly implies that other people regarded Lady Carlotta as. Looking at that question, we can also see number 4 is paired with it. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous questions? When these are paired together, we never want to separate them. So if we're prioritizing questions, etc., other questions can get jumbled around in the order we do them, but 3 and 4, we always want to move them together. If we do them first, if we do them last, whatever works for you, we want to do them together. So there's some specific approaches we can take when we have these paired questions, because our answer for number 3, we have to develop based on what we see in the text, and they give us specific parts of the text here. The process for answering questions that are paired together, like 3 and 4, is usually a little bit more time-consuming. It's not going to take forever, but it's a little bit more time-consuming than like question 2. But with the specific process we're going to go through in a second, it's usually pretty direct to answer them. Would be one to maybe save once you've done the more specific questions. Okay, moving on to number 5. The description of how Lady Carlotta put the doctrine of non-interference into practice, lines 14 through 15, mainly serves to, we've got a specific line reference. Whenever that happens, they are doing us a favor. So I talked about how we have to look through kind of like a detective to find those specific parts of the text that we already know are going to be asked about. Right here, when they mention a specific line, they're doing a lot of work for us, because now we don't have to look through and find what they're talking about. They give us the specific place. So when they give us that specific place, that is a good indication you should prioritize this a little bit higher, because it's going to save you some time. It'll go a little bit quicker. However, it does require a bit of interpretation, because we're talking about the purpose of this statement. With the when we're interpreting the purpose of this statement, we do have to give it a little bit of context. We have to read a little bit wider than just the line they've given us. But since they've started us off with line 14 to 15, it's probably going to go fairly quickly. We get to number 6, line 55, charge most nearly means. So that's another vocabulary question. Those are ones that we probably want to do first. Moving on to number 7. The narrator indicates that Claus, Wilfred, Irene, and Viola are this kind of question. Probably one that you want to do last. These are some of the more difficult kinds of questions that you'll see, depending on the passage. But this word here, indicates. That means that whatever that they say, whatever our answers are here, are not directly related. We can't take words out of the passage and find them in the answer, or vice versa. We have to do some interpretation, quite a lot of interpretation usually. That's going to mean when the narrator is talking about Claude, Wilfred, Irene, and Viola, we're going to have to search for the context in which they're mentioned, interpret what the narrator is trying to get across, and find our matching answer. So a question like number 7 is probably one to save towards the end, because that's going to require a lot more work and more time to get through. Okay, moving on to number 8. The narrator implies that Mrs. Cubaro favors a form of education that emphasizes. Okay, so here, again, we are not given a specific context, and also it says the narrator implies. That means we are going to have to do some interpretation. We're going to have to see what they're implying, because they're not going to say it in a straightforward way. So this, again, is probably going to take a little bit more time. Number 9, as presented in the passage, Mrs. Quadraro is best described as, okay, so this one's a little bit more straightforward, because we're just looking for a description here. However, it doesn't give us a specific point at which we have to look for a description. It's just saying, as presented in the passage. That's going to require us to kind of have a more comprehensive view of how this character is described in this passage. This one might be one to prioritize the detailed questions over as well. However, we can see that this does have a paired response. These are our 10 questions. We kind of broken down what they look like, what they're going to be asking about. So now we can start to make a plan. Let's start with number 2 and number 6. These questions are probably going to be the most straightforward to answer, and there's this kind of specific way that we can look at these vocabulary questions. So the way we do that, let's start with number 2. So it says, in line 2, turn most nearly means. So what we're going to do is go up to line 2 and find where they're using the word turn. Lady Carlotta stepped out on the platform of the small wayside and took a turn or two up and down its uninteresting length to kill time till the train should be pleased to proceed on it. All right, so what we want to do is take that whole sentence. We want to take that whole sentence because the SAT, a lot of times, and in every section, is going to try and trick you. If you just read the portion, just read the line, they're usually going to include an answer that is intentionally designed to be misleading if you don't read the whole thing. So that's why we want to read the whole sentence. If that's not enough context, you can read the sentence before and after. Since this is the first one, we know there's not a before. But from there, we want to try and think of our own placeholder word. Lady Carlotta stepped on the platform of the small wayside town and took a turn or two up and down its uninteresting lane. Sounds like she's taking a walk through this town. We want to have that placeholder word because when we go to our options, we can compare our placeholder word to their placeholder words. Because when we replace that word, we're getting to the meaning of it, not just what they've chosen. So that word, that they can pick out homophones, they can pick out words with overlapping meanings that don't mean the same thing. They can pick out that word's meaning in a different context. But if we have our placeholder word, those aren't going to apply. We just can match the meaning together. From that brief description, if we can say that she's taking a walk, we can look at our answers. And when we're answering a question, we want to apply process of elimination. So applying process of elimination, we can see slight movement, probably we can eliminate. change in rotation. This is a good example. Change in rotation, turn in a different context could mean that. And that's why we use that placeholder word, so we don't fall for a trick answer like that. So we can eliminate B as well. Short walk, that matches pretty directly with what we used as a placeholder. Course correction, that doesn't. We can answer number 2 is C, short walk. Now we can do the same thing with number 6. In line 55, charge most nearly means. Okay, so everyone go to line 55. Let's look at the word charge. During the drive to the Cubaro mansion, Lady Carlotta was impressively introduced to the nature of the charge that had been thrust upon her. We learned that Claude and Wilfred were delicate and sensitive young people, and that Irene had the artistic temperament highly developed, that Viola was something or other else of a mold equally commonplace, etc., etc., etc. From that context, so notice I continued reading after the semicolon because I wanted all of the context here. From that context, who she's being introduced to are these children, Claude, Wilfred, and Irene. When they give us this word charge, depending on how much we understand of the other context, we can at least say it's these kids, Claude, Wilfred, and Irene. We get a little bit more into it, it would be her responsibility. So she is going to work for this family and nanny these kids, so they are going to be her job or her responsibility, but at least we can find the definition that's going to match with these kids. Let's look at our options here. Responsibility, attack, fee, or expense. Pretty directly, we can eliminate B, attack, C, fee. So both of those, attack and fee, can mean the word charge in different contexts. So that's, again, why we want that placeholder, so we don't fall for homophones, meanings in different contexts, synonyms, etc. At least we know it's responsibility or expense. Worst case scenario, you get yourself into this position, you can guess. Now you've narrowed it down to a 1 in 2 chance of guessing. So that's why process of elimination is a great place to start. But let's look a little bit closer. The responsibility and expense. We look back at our context, there's nothing to indicate that these kids are taking anything away, are being an expense of any kind, and the other context indicates that they are her responsibility. So we can go with A for number 6, responsibility. I got really in depth into those two problems. Let me know if you have any questions in the chat about how we approach the vocabulary problems. But let's move on to our next kind of group of questions. I want to go over 3 and 4 and 9 and 10 because the way we approached paired questions, it's a little bit more in depth, but it's also really useful. So let's start with 3 and 4. The passage most clearly implies that other people regarded Lady Carlotta as outspoken, tactful, ambitious, or unfriendly. And then our paired question, which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? When you have a question like this, in a counterintuitive way, we are going to approach question 4 first. So it's counterintuitive because we're picking the evidence that best supported an answer that we haven't given yet. So the reason we're going to do this is because we can narrow down what evidence is appropriate. So when we narrow down what evidence is appropriate, if we can get down to one piece of evidence, that's going to give us our answer automatically to the previous question. When you go, we're applying our strategy. We read through our questions first. They give us these questions with a specific group of lines. That's when you want to go through and annotate your text. Lines 10 through 14, you want to underline those. 22 through 23, underline. Same with 23 through 26 and 30 through 32. And you want to make a note that these lines are connected to how people regarded Lady Carlotta. Now we really want to be careful here. We're narrowing down these pieces of evidence. We're picking which ones are applicable to this description about how people regarded Lady Carlotta. Now, a very important element of the way they phrase this question is that they say, the passage clearly implies that other people regarded Lady Carlotta. When they've specified who this description applies to, which is other people and how they regarded her, that narrows down what's going to be applicable. And if we apply that really strictly, it's going to help us out when maybe we're not entirely sure. So let's take a look through here. Let's start with lines 10 through 14. Okay, 10 through 14. Lady Carlotta promptly betook her to the roadway and put rather a different complexion on the struggle. Certain of her acquaintances were wont to give her plentiful admonition as to the undesirability of interfering on behalf of distressed animals, such interference being none of her business. Something that perks my interest here. Certain of her acquaintances, her friends, people she knew, other people, which is specifically what question 3 asked about, are telling her something, that she shouldn't interfere on behalf of distressed animals. That pretty directly applies if we're asking about what other people think of her or how they regard her. I don't think we can eliminate that one yet. So let's hold on to option A. Moving on to option B, lines 22 through 23. It is to Lady. Okay, so looking at 20 through, it is to be feared that she lost the friendship of the ultimately rescued lady. Looking at this, it is to be feared that she lost the friendship of the ultimately rescued lady. It doesn't quite give us the perspective of other people or what they're doing. We do see a mention of a different lady, but we don't really have anything specifically commenting on their opinion of Lady Carlotta. That comes back to question 3 and strictly applying that. What fits with what question 3 is asking us? And I think we can eliminate lines 22 through 23 as they don't strictly fit with what question 3 is asking. Moving on to C, 23 through 26. Okay. On this through her. Okay. On this occasion, she merely lost the train, which gave way to the first sign of impatience it had shown throughout her journey, and steamed off without her. Again, we don't have any mention of other people. It's a train. That's, again, why applying that criteria of question 3 really strictly. This is intentionally put in there so that it's hoping that if you're reading through quickly, you think, okay, someone is impatient with Lady Carlotta, got it, or something to that effect. But because it's not giving us other people's perspective of Lady Carlotta, we can eliminate it. Moving on to line option D, 30 through 32, she through the train. Okay, she wired a vague non-committal message to her destination to say that she was coming on by another train. Okay, so again, we don't have anyone else giving an opinion of Lady Carlotta. We can eliminate option D. What we've done here is narrowed down what our evidence is. Now that we've narrowed down what our evidence can be to option A, we can use that to answer number 3. The passage most clearly implies that other people regarded Lady Carlotta. If we revisit that, lines 10 through 14, that's when they were telling her not to interfere on behalf of distressed animals, such interference being none of her business. So these people regarded her as getting into things that were none of her business. We can say maybe they regarded her as nosy, bossy, something like that, where now we can look for whatever matches with that description. So we can see in number 3, we've got outspoken, full, ambitious, and unfriendly. We want to use process of elimination. Kind of the 2 ways that we're going to eliminate something is if it's the opposite of what we want, or if it doesn't apply in general. So it's usually easier to pick out the ones that are the opposite. So something like tactful, not going to fit in if people are telling her to mind her own business. So we can eliminate tactful. Now let's look at our other ones: outspoken, ambitious, and unfriendly. Outspoken probably fits pretty directly if people were telling her to mind her own business. Ambitious and unfriendly would apply, but they are a little bit more specific. So ambitious means she's trying to achieve something. She's, a ladder climber, something like that, where she is trying to achieve certain goals. Unfriendly would mean she's specifically unfriendly to certain people. And from that passage, we can't see evidence to support either C or D. So we can eliminate those and go with A, outspoken, as our answer. The reason we take this backwards approach, the reason we start with number 4 and go to number 3, is because if we try and match pick an answer for number 3, then match the evidence, there's a lot of ways they're going to try and mislead you. They're going to present things that are tangentially related, that are sort of related, sound like they could be right, and they're going to provide you with evidence that if you go with an answer that you're sort of confident in, might reinforce that, but it's not going to be as clearly related to the answer as it should be. So if we do it in reverse, the kind of misleading answers that have been set up, you can avoid those because the evidence that you choose is going to directly indicate your answer for you. So we want to find pieces of the text to answer the questions for us on our behalf. We've got a few more minutes of talking about the reading section before we move on to writing and language. So I'd like to look at, let's see, we talked about 9 and 10 as a paired one. Okay, let's look at number 7. This is a really tough one. The narrator indicates that Claude, Wilfred, Irene, and Viola are. Here we have to do a lot of heavy lifting, essentially, because they don't tell us where this discussion is. Great question in the chat. What if you don't know the answer to the question? You're referring to, I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you narrow it down, but you aren't 100% sure in choosing your final answer? So that's why we want to apply our process of elimination. Okay, got it. So that's why we want to apply a process of elimination. Because with these multiple choice questions, there is only one answer. And we know there's only one answer, even if it seems like there's not. If we're not sure, we can narrow it down based on what, not just what seems right, but what cannot possibly be wrong. So that's why we look at number 3 and we make a very specific criteria for looking at our evidence. You want to be really strict with these questions. So like I talked about with these answers, we can eliminate what's the opposite, which is pretty easy, and then what doesn't quite apply, which is a little bit more difficult. But like I was mentioning with ambitious and unfriendly, if you're not sure, outspoken, ambitious, and unfriendly kind of could be overlapping in their meaning. We want to look for what we cannot possibly say no to. So if you have evidence to support it, then you can select it. That's why I like to start with the evidence. Because if there's evidence in the text to support your answer, it has to be correct. So there's going to be answers that seem like they could be correct, but if you can't point to something in the text and say it's correct because of this, then you can eliminate it. That kind of really strict level of evaluation of your answer options is going to help you choose the correct one in those situations where you've kind of narrowed it down but aren't entirely sure. You want to be really strict based on what you can kind of point to something in the text and say it is right because it says so in the text. Does that make sense? Let me know if that answered your question. Looking at, okay, number 7. So Claude, Wilfred, Irene, and Viola are. They don't give us any line numbers. They don't give us any paragraphs to look in. So what we have to do, right, we're applying our strategy. We look through the questions first. We go to our passage. We're reading through. We have to look for where the context is going to be. kind of a key thing that they give us are all of these names. So if we skim through, we don't see these names until we get down to here, right? Claude, Wilfred, Irene. Were they in this discussion earlier? No, it doesn't look so. Once we find that information, now we can dig in to where they're introduced. So that part, that's our first step, is finding the appropriate context. Now we have to dig in to make our own conclusion. So once we find that appropriate information, we want to think about the question. It indicates that they are, and it's asking us similar to their peers, unusually creative or intelligent. So it's essentially asking us about their description, but their implied description. We want to come to a conclusion on our own and compare it to the answer options. So the reason we want to do that is because it makes it easier, again, to avoid those misleading answer options. Let's read through, let's see, it looks like line 53 through 61. That's going to give us the information we want. During the drive to the Cubaro mansion, Lady Carlotta was impressively introduced to the nature of the charge that had been thrust upon her. We learned that Claude and Wilfred were delicate, sensitive young people, and Irene had the artistic temperament highly developed, and that Viola was something or other else of a mold equally commonplace among children of that class and type in the 20th century. One thing we can see coming through in this part of the passage is that especially with some of these older works, this is from 1911, the language can get a little bit complicated. It's okay if you have a hard time reading it. Some of these get really ornate and flowery in their language, but that's why we want to stick to reading with evidence. We're looking for evidence to answer our question. So based on this discussion, what can we see here? Claude and Wilfred, delicate, sensitive. Irene, artistic. Viola, something or other else of a mold equally commonplace among children of that class and type in the 20th century. That is a very complicated question, but if we break it down, something or other else of a mold. So mold, this is a little bit contingent on understanding that vocabulary. Mold meaning like a model or a type. So she's a type that's equally commonplace of children, that class, and that time period. Essentially, that statement, very complicated, is that she's just kind of average. We've got Claude and Wilfred, delicate, Irene, artistic, Viola, average. Looking at our discussion here, Claude, Wilfred, and Irene and Viola are similar to many of their peers, usually creative and intelligent, hostile to the idea of a governess, more educated than others of their age. Now, this is a great example of when we can eliminate things based on not having evidence, rather than just being the opposite of what we want. For example, more educated than others of their age. Because we worked through to kind of translate that statement at the end, you can see that they're pretty average for the kids their age. So we can eliminate option D. C, hostile to the idea of a governess. There's nothing to indicate that. There's nothing to go against it. But if there's no evidence to tell us that they're hostile, we can eliminate it. We can eliminate C. B, unusually creative and intelligent. It does tell us here, Claude and Wilfred, delicate, sensitive. Irene is artistic. Viola, average. But there's nothing to indicate that they are unusually creative and intelligent. So this is why questions like these can be really tricky and a little bit difficult, is that small details like that can really create a confusing scenario, create very tempting answer options. And that's why we have that strict criteria we have to apply, that there has to be evidence to support it. There's nothing to indicate that they are unusually creative and intelligent. But we do have evidence that says they are similar to many of their peers, right? The end talks about how they are, or how Viola was something equal or average to kids of her age and of that time. That's what we have evidence to support. I'd like to move on to the writing and language section. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions on this passage, but I think we got a really good discussion in about some of our more complicated setups. Does anyone have any questions about the reading section before I move on? Go ahead and put them in the chat now. So let's go ahead and move on to the writing and language section. But if you have a question, feel free to ask it. We'll just transition over. The writing and language section. So this is what I talked about earlier. The reading and the questions are concurring. They're right next to each other. So we don't kind of like the reading section where we read and answer questions, or kind of they're separate. Here they're right next to each other and we're just editing the reading. So it's going to go fairly quickly. So let's look through 1 through 11, which are the questions that apply to this passage. You can see number 1. That's going to be a question of probably about punctuation. We've got healthy and more, healthier and they are, healthier being more. So punctuation, sentence structure maybe, but it's probably a rules-based question. Moving on to number 2. Which choice provides the most appropriate introduction to the passage? This is a great example of a rhetoric question where we can't just kind of apply a general rule to figure it out, but we have to think in terms of the structure of our passage. What is the concept being introduced? What makes one of these introductions more appropriate than the other? And this is probably going to require a little bit more context. We're going to have to read a little bit more of this passage. Moving on to number 3. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Okay, so for this kind of question, this is a pretty common setup for the writing and language section. We can see that the answers are yes, yes, no, no. And it's always going to be 2 yes and 2 no. They're all going to have different reasons. But when you approach a question like this, you want to read through it on your own to get a sense of the context, and you want to read through it with the addition in there. And on your own, based on your own thinking, you want to say yes or no, it should be included. It should be included or it should be excluded. Then you can just eliminate the 2 options that don't match. So if you selected no, you can eliminate A and B and just focus on picking the reason that matches with yours for C and D. We'll come back to questions like that. That's a kind of useful approach for a pretty common setup. All right, moving on to number 4. So this one is going to be about punctuation. So we can see we've got a potential plural apostrophe. We can see we've got possessive apostrophes. So we have to choose what's going to match with this scenario. Moving on to number 5. We're going to have to choose the appropriate usage in this sentence here. So this is another rules-based question. Moving on to number 6. Which choice best supports the statement made in the previous sentence? There we've got a rhetoric question. We have to think about what supports it. So this is what we're looking at. It is an essay. It's making an argument. Somewhere in right before number 6 here, in this sentence, there's a claim that we have to support logically. That is, we have to think about that in terms of what is going to support it as a claim. So that also probably going to require a little bit more context, a little bit more time than the punctuation, the rules-based questions. Okay, moving on to number 7. In context, which choice best combines the underlined sentences? These questions, you want to look through, you want to read them separately and look for the information kind of that overlaps. Then you want to look at your answer options, and anything where the overlapping information happens twice, so they keep the question separate, you want to eliminate. You could, looking in these answer options, you want to look for things like repetition, redundancy, any idea that's expressed twice, even if they rephrase it, and you want to look for grammatical errors or anything that just makes it awkward. That's, even though that's pretty general, it's a good rule of thumb. If it sounds awkward, it's not, you don't necessarily have to eliminate it, but it's likely that you should be suspicious. We'll come back to number 7 in a second. Okay, moving on to number 8. no change every year per year, or delete the underlying portion. This is about usage. We have to see if this fits in logically. This kind of question, we don't necessarily have a rule we can follow. We just have to see if the information we're providing fits in, or if it doesn't fit in to that sentence. Then moving on to number 9, these kinds of questions, we're choosing a transition. So when we choose a transition, we have to look at the context and consider what is the idea before and the idea after, how are they related, and that's going to tell us the transition word to use. Okay, and then moving on to number 10, here we have appropriate usage, and then number 11 of from, we're choosing the proper word for that one. This is one of our 4 writing and language passages. With our writing and language passage, the order is kind of less important for the reading passage than for the reading passages. Reading time is a little bit tighter because the passages, reading and comprehending them is more significant of a task for that section. Comprehension makes up less of the work for the writing and language. So you can usually skip around a little bit more. If you want to work through in order, that also works. But again, with that general principle of emphasizing your strengths, you want to look for questions you're comfortable with, content areas you're confident in, things like that. Let's start working through our questions. And one thing I want to focus on is how do we identify how much we should read? So let's start with number 1. So looking at number 1, we're choosing healthier, comma, and more. Is that, do we change that? For a question like this, we usually want to read the whole sentence. So we want to go beyond just the line, kind of for similar reasons to the reading passage, because they're going to have misleading answer options that look correct if you don't read the whole thing. So reading through this, studies have shown that employees are happier, healthier, and more productive when they work in an environment in which temperatures are carefully controlled. Okay, so looking at our setup here, you can see happier, comma, healthier, comma, and more productive when they work in an environment where temperatures are carefully controlled. First, we want to look for, is anything obviously wrong? Does anything stand out as definitely incorrect based on the rules we're familiar with? And then we want to compare that and read through with our other options. Reading through that, I don't find anything obviously wrong, but we can take a look through our answer options and see if anything stands out that would seem like a better fit. We've got employees are healthy, are happier, healthy, and more productive. Let's point out why we can eliminate B. So our list here of things employees like about controlled temperatures. They are happier and healthier. So that's matching kind of the format in our list. So if your list is about things that end in even though it's maybe not a strict rule, that should be consistent throughout. So if we go with healthy, happier and healthy, that's breaking that consistency. So we can eliminate option B. Option C, healthier, and they are more productive when they work in an environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here, we can eliminate option C because of a redundant usage of a word. So studies have shown that employees are happier, et cetera, and they are more productive, and they are productive. So that would kind of change the meaning of the word by the inclusion of this additional and they are. Because we want it to say they are more productive. But if it just says they are productive, now we have 2 separate statements. Employees are happier and healthier, and they are productive, which is not what we're trying to say. Moving on to option D, employees are happier, healthier, and being more productive when they work in an environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Option D gives us the same meaning, but this phrasing of being more productive is this use of being. We already have the verb are. They are happier, healthier, and more productive. So that are is applied to happier, healthier, and more productive. We say being more productive, that is redundant. We already have something that tells us that is what they are doing. We can eliminate B, C, and D. We can see that option A, no change, is our correct option here. Reading through, looking for logical inconsistencies, looking for anything that changes the meaning of a sentence to something that it shouldn't be saying. These are things that you can use in your process of elimination. Okay, moving on to number 2. Which choice provides the most appropriate introduction to the passage? Okay, so this is a great kind of question. We want to expand our context a little bit. We probably want to go beyond just a sentence for this one, especially if we're talking about the introduction for the whole passage. We should probably look at the first paragraph. Usually it's not going to be too long. Sometimes it'll be very conveniently short, but right here, this is all we have to read through here. We want to read through this to get an idea of what they're going to talk about. We don't have to really get into too much specifics, just so we have an idea of what the argument is that's going to follow. Studies have shown that employees are happier, healthier, and more productive when they work in an environment in which temperatures are carefully controlled. New buildings may be designed with these studies in mind, but many older buildings were not, resulting in spaces that often depend primarily on artificial lighting. While employers may balk at the expense of reconfiguring such buildings to increase the amount of natural light, the investment has been shown to be well worth it in the long run for both employees and employers. Looking at the rest of that introduction, we can see that this discussion of temperature kind of fizzles out, but there is a discussion of artificial lighting, natural light, but the continuation of temperature isn't there. So looking, even if we wanted to look more into the rest of our passage for continued context, for one thing, lack of exposure to natural light has significant impact on employees' health. So that's a good indication. What we have for number 2, in which talking about temperature control, does not fit in with this continued discussion of natural light. Let's take a look at our answer options and see if anything fits with that. See, right off the bat, option B, that affords them adequate amounts of natural light. So that's a great contender, but we can just double check. C, that is thoroughly sealed to prevent energy loss. D, in which they feel comfortable asking managers for special accommodations. While C and D, and even A, could fit in just if we're reading through, it might sound kind of natural. There's no kind of obvious grammar errors. There's no like logical inconsistencies. They're not contradicting themselves, but it's not on topic, which is the criteria that we want to be using for a question like this. So option B is the only one that is on topic. And we can determine what the topic is by expanding our context a little bit and looking for those clues about artificial lighting, natural lighting, stuff like that. Okay, moving on to number 3. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Okay, so this is the recurring format of the question that I mentioned earlier. With this recurring format, we can have a consistent approach. This inclusion here, workers in the office with windows sleep an average of 46 minutes more per night than workers in offices without windows. We want to read through our context with, without it, read through our context with it, see which one seems more appropriate. Looking at where we would include it right there, we can start with the sentence before and go through to the sentence after. A study conducted in 2013 by Northwestern University in Chicago shows that inadequate natural light could result in eye strain, headache, and fatigue, as well as interference with the body's circadian rhythms. Okay. Workers in offices with windows sleep an average of 46 minutes more per night than workers in offices without windows. Circadian rhythms, which are controlled by the body's biological clocks, influence body temperature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, sorry I cut that off at the end there, but it's the description of circadian rhythms isn't quite as applicable as what we should be looking at, which is that this discussion of circadian rhythms, we have a mention of it, and then it's immediately followed up with an explanation. So this is something that will come up again, probably on the writing and language section, that a term is mentioned and then explained. When that occurs, we don't want to interrupt that. If we put this statistic in right here, we're going to separate the mention of circadian rhythms from the explanation of circadian rhythms. And if we kind of take that away, it's going to be awkward. It's going to change kind of the flow of the ideas and the argument. Based on that, just reading through it like that, we want to choose, yes, should it be included, or no, it should not be included. I'm going to go with no, so we can immediately eliminate A and B. Let's look at C and D. C, no, because it interrupts the discussion of circadian rhythms, or D, no, because it does not take into account whether workers were exposed to sunlight outside of the office. We want to come up with our own reason beforehand. So that's like we were just discussing, because we want to see what matches. So we can see that C matches pretty directly. D, it does not take into account whether workers were exposed to sunlight outside of the office. While it might be true about our statement, doesn't apply here. It's not the reason we want to take it out. So if we come in with our own reason ready, we can compare, and that way anything that's irrelevant doesn't kind of trick us into choosing it. That's kind of the approach you can take for questions like number 3. You want to read through it on your own, look at the context, and make your own selection of yes or no, have your own reason to compare to your whatever yes or no answer matches with yours. Okay, how are we doing with time? 8:06. Okay, why don't we work through maybe one more and then move on to our math section. Okay, so let's take a look at number 4 real quick. So number 4, this is a rules-based question. This is all about punctuation. So looking at this, circadian rhythms, which are controlled by the body's biological clocks, influence temperatures, cycles of sleep, wakefulness, other bodily functions. So we're editing body's biological clocks. So this is all about understanding the possessive apostrophe, the plural apostrophe, and the plural possessive apostrophe. When the apostrophe is inside the S, apostrophe S, that means one thing has something else, or multiple things. If the apostrophe comes after the S, so S apostrophe, that means multiple things have something, as a plural apostrophe, or a plural possessive, pardon me. So looking at our statement, circadian rhythms, they are controlled by the body's biological clocks. So we've got bodies, which is not possessive, biological clocks, which is also not possessive. Biological clocks, our kind of item, belongs to bodies. It's the body's biological clock. So bodies should be possessive. Looking at our options here, we can eliminate A, bodies is not possessive. So B, C, and D are our only options. Now let's continue narrowing it down. Biological clocks. So clocks is plural, but is it possessive? There's no reference to the clocks having something, so it shouldn't have a possessive apostrophe. So that means we can eliminate B, and we can eliminate D. We can go with C, bodies, biological clocks. The process of elimination, when you're applying even punctuation rules, you can know them off the top of your head, or you can just narrow it down based on what makes sense and what doesn't. Let's get ready to move on to the math section and go over some math questions. Does anyone have any questions about the writing and language section? You're free to put it in the chat. I'm just going to start transitioning to our discussion of math. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and ask them now. But I'm going to transition to our discussion of the math. On the math portion, let's start with no calculator. 25 minutes, 20 questions. So one thing I want to discuss is that these multiple choice questions, this is what you're going to see for the first 15. And then the last 5, you're going to have this. We can see there's no answers here. There's nothing for us to choose from because we have to plug the answers in kind of like this. You have to bubble them in. So 7/12, so you have to bubble 7/1, 2. It's oftentimes, a lot of the students that I've had come in with the impression that the non-multiple choice, that the grid-in questions are going to be more difficult. So that's not always true. In fact, we can kind of gauge the difficulty of the questions because there's a progression of difficulty. So the questions are going to get harder as you go along. So 1 is probably going to be about your easiest question. 15 is probably going to be about your hardest, but then that resets. 16 is going to be your easiest grid-in question, and 20 is going to be your hardest grid-in question. Once you get to a point where you're skipping through questions, right, to prioritize your strengths, skipping questions, you can come back to them, skip all the way through the multiple choice. You can skip ahead before you do the really hard multiple choice questions. You can skip ahead and do some of the easier grid-in questions. So strategically, that's what you want to be doing, skipping through, emphasizing your strengths, following that progression of difficulty to know where the harder, more time-consuming questions are, where the easier, probably quicker questions are. So let's start looking through some of our easier questions. So starting with number 1, painter paints end walls with the same size shape in a building using a specific brand of paint. Painter's fee can be calculated with this expression, n times k times L times H, and then they give us the distinction of what each variable means. We have to identify what specific variable applies to what specific thing. So this is a pretty common type of question. It's usually fairly straightforward and oftentimes comes up in the first few questions of your math section. So looking here, K is the constant with units of dollar per foot. L is the length of each wall in feet. H is the height of each wall in feet. The customer asks the painter to use a more expensive brand of paint. Which of the factors in the expression would change? We want to think about the cost of the paint in this equation, right? NKLH. So we can also use process of elimination. N is the number of walls. That's not going to change. We can eliminate N. L is the length of feet. The walls are not going to get bigger. We can eliminate L. H is the height of the walls. Again, not going to get bigger. We can eliminate that. It has to be K. So K is our correct answer for number 1. Moving on to number 3. Which of the following is equal to a to the 2/3? We'll go to number 2 and then number 3. If 3r is equal to 18, what is the value of 6r plus 3? This is kind of an example of the very basic algebra questions that they'll build on. You'll see questions that are pretty similar to this, but they'll just get more complicated as the section goes along, or if we go to the next section. So 3r equals 18. What is the value of 6r plus 3? The steps to solve a problem like this, you solve for r. What we have to do, we have to undo this 3 to get r by itself. So we divide by 3. We get r equals 6. Then we can plug that in here, and we get 6 times 6 is 36, plus 3 is 39. So then we get our answer. We can also kind of do this in reverse if you're looking for another way to approach this question. We could take 6 plus r, and we could make it equal to each of our questions, each of our options. So 6r plus 3 equals 6. 6r plus 3 equals 27. And then we could solve for r and plug it into our other question. Whichever one works, whichever one gives us 3r equals 18, has to be the true value of r. That one's a little bit more complicated. That kind of reverse approach gets more valuable on the more difficult, more complicated questions. All right, let's look at number 3. Which of the following is equal to a to the 2/3 for all values of a? This kind of question, it's really valuable to know your rules of exponents. So rules of exponents don't come up very often on this kind of test, but when they do, it's just really useful to know them because the problems, you can work around them sometimes, but if you don't know them, they can be very difficult. What we see here, a to the 2/3, a fractional exponent. So when we have a fractional exponent, the top number, in this case the 2, that means a squared. So a to the 2. The bottom number, 3 is our root. So cube root. So that means we have a to the square underneath our cube root. Our answer for number 3 would be D. All right, moving on to number 4. The number of states that joined the United States between 1776 and 1849 is twice the number of states that joined between 1850 and 1900. If 30 states joined the United States between 1776 and 1849, and X states joined between 1850 and 1900, which of the following equations is true? This kind of word problem requires a bit of interpretation to establish what our equation is. We start with our variable, right? 30 states joined the United States between this time period, 1776 and 1849. X states joined between 1850 and 1900. The numbers and all the kind of trivia they're throwing in here about years, states, etc., is not important. What we need is just to keep in mind the categories that we're thinking of. The categories are 1776 to 1849 and 1850 to 1900. X, or pardon me, 30 and X. So when it tells us the number of states that joined the United States between 1776 and 1849 is twice the number of states that joined between 1850 and 1900, we can say that 2x is equal to 30. So this kind of phrasing, like if we look at, what's a good example? Option A, or usually it won't be option A, but something like 2 times 30 equals x, that can usually be tricky. You want to be very careful, specifically when they use terms like double or half, that you're careful about setting up which one is double to be equal the other. Here it would be option B, 2x equals 30. We have to read that carefully just to establish which is being doubled in this equation. Usually questions 1 through 4 going to go pretty quickly and involve some basic algebra for like number 3, knowing the rules of exponents. It's pretty direct application of them. You don't have to do much rearranging things. If we look through here, number 5, what is the value of x over 5? So this is an example of where we could use our reverse approach. So we could take x over 5 and we could set it equal to all of our answers, 10, 5, 2, and 1/2. We could solve for x, and for each of those solutions of x, if we plugged it into our equation, whichever one functions correctly, whichever one gives us equal answers on both sides, would have to be correct. Again, that's a little bit more time consuming. The faster way to do it is to solve for x here, and then plug that into our x over 5. Okay. Moving on to number 6. Number 6 is a really common format of question. Systems of equations. Systems of equations, you're going to need to familiarize yourself with. Methods to solve systems of equations, you can use substitution, adding and subtracting the equations from each other. Occasionally that requires you to maybe multiply one equation or divide it so that it cancels out something in the other. But let's take a look at this setup. So if x and y is a solution to the system of equations above, what is the value of x minus y? So this statement, this is pretty SAT specific language. They try and make it more complicated than it needs to be. If xy is the solution to the system of equations, that essentially just means solve for x and y and plug it into x minus y. So we can do that. What we also can do is try and see if there's a way we can add or subtract the equations to get our answer. You take a look here, if we just add these equations together, we just treat it like an addition problem. 2x plus 3x would be 5x, negative 3y minus 3y would be negative 5y, and negative 14 plus negative 6 would be negative 20. So what we end up with is 5x minus 5y equals negative 20. What we can do then is simplify. We divide everything by 5, we get x minus y equals negative 4. those opportunities come up a lot. Keep an eye out when you see a system of equation you can solve using substitution. That's always going to work, but there are other occasions when you can kind of take a shortcut. You can add them together, you can subtract one from the other. Maybe you have to multiply 1 times 2 and then subtract, but those occasions are going to arise really often where there's a simple solution and you can solve for something like x minus y, especially if they ask you for the solution to an algebraic term. There's usually a way you can add or subtract them to put it in that form. Okay, moving on to number 7. So this kind of setup with the input and output for a function, again, can sometimes be kind of confusing if you're not familiar with the way the SAT talks about things. So let's take a look. The function f is defined by a polynomial. Some values of x and f of x are shown in the table above. Which of the following must be a factor of f of x? What that means is x is our input, f of x is our output. The equation that happens to our input to make our output is a polynomial. Polynomials come up a lot on the SAT. So that's just any equation with more than one term, right? So x plus a times x plus b, that's a polynomial. When we're trying to figure this out, we have to think of this as the inputs and outputs of an equation that has a bunch of different terms multiplied together that we don't know what they are. So we can only think in terms of inputs and outputs. One thing that we do know for polynomials, any polynomials, can be quadratic, trinomial, any degree of polynomial, that if you have 0 as an output, that means you're crossing the x-axis. Okay, if you're crossing the x-axis, that means you have plugged in an x value that has canceled out one of your terms. Because they're all being multiplied together, when 1 is equal to 0, if they're all multiplied times 0, becomes 0. Whatever input you've plugged in has canceled out one of your terms to make it a 0. You've crossed the x-axis, you have an x-intercept. So if we plug in x equals 4, that means it turns that term into 0. When it asks us, some of the values of x and f of x are shown in the table above, which of the following must be a factor of f of x? What has to be one of the terms? It has to be x minus 4, because 4 minus 4 is 0. That's going to turn our whole polynomial into 0, no matter how many terms we have, no matter what. This is a very tricky question. It requires you to understand what polynomials are, requires you to interpret the way the SAT sets up this question with their inputs and their outputs, and it requires you to do some problem solving. Be aware of that in the future, that the way questions are asked, the way they phrase this, requires a little bit of critical thinking. And also be aware that almost all of the time the SAT is trying to trick you and mislead you. So again, just like on the reading, even on the writing and language, just like it's going to be the same on the math, we have to kind of think in terms of evidence. What do we have evidence to think about? We only know that it's a polynomial. We can't really think of any scenario that would be convenient where some of our other examples might work. We can only think of what has to be true. Okay, let's see if there are any other good examples for us to go over here. Number 10, in the xy plane, the parabola with the equation y equals x minus 11 squared intersects the line with the equation y equals 25 at 2 points. Great place to start with a question like this is to sketch yourself a diagram. Even if you don't know exactly where anything goes, you know there's a line and a parabola and that they intersect. So once you have that visual, you can start putting the pieces together. We know that they intersect at 2 points, and they tell us that the line is y equals 25. Essentially, they've set up a very complicated scenario where you can put this parabola equal to 25 and solve. When you have that visual with you, it makes it a little bit more direct in your approach of what you can look at and then solve for. So once you set that equal to 25, Now we're just solving a quadratic equation. With the quadratic equation, really useful to know the quadratic formula. If you don't know it, highly suggest you memorize it because it's going to be very handy. You can try and rely on factoring. Most of the time that's going to work, but there are definitely going to be occasions when you need to know the formula. You don't have that memorized, strongly suggest you work on that. Okay, 13 is a great example of where we can kind of work backwards. There are a lot of ways you can approach a question like 13. One way would be to plug in these different values of a. We plugged in -16 for a in here. Would that make these equations equal? Same thing for -3, 3 and 16. Wherever we plug it in, whatever makes them equal has to then be the value of a, because again, the evidence shows us right there that it's equal because it has set up the equation that way. Okay, this is a type of question I think we can approach. You can see the calculator section immediately instead of those pure algebra questions, getting into the more real life scenario, data-driven problems where we have to do a little bit more interpretation and our data isn't as neat. The numbers don't always work out as logically. Sometimes it requires a little bit of estimation or rounding, etc. Moving through here, we can also see questions like the sum of our polynomials, where we're again using kind of that approach we took with the systems of equations where we're adding the equations together, pairing like terms. We can also see, again, they're using the input-output function setup.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.